Welcome. My name is Kiley Fleming, and I'm the Executive Director of Iowa Mediation Service. And the services that we provide for the state of Iowa are agricultural mediations. I'm also a facilitator for the International Farm Transition Network. So I was asked today to present on stress and communication. So we're going to have this be a layered lecture where we're going to start and talk first about the components of stress, because in a lot of our world, whether it's personal or professional, agricultural or not, stress is a part of the world. And then how do we respond and communicate in a way that helps us bring about the desired results when we are in stress and or crisis? So without further ado, I'm going to start this PowerPoint. So the first thing is, let's define what stress is. Stress can be physical, mental, or emotional. And it can also be the demands that are real or perceived. So real stress, if you will, tends to be more objective in nature. So an example would be, my husband just had a heart attack. That's a real stress, right? Perceived stress, they tend to be more subjective in nature. Here's the example I've given. I haven't heard from my sister, so I wonder if she is mad at me. Here's the deal. Whether or not it's real or perceived, the body internalizes that stress. It doesn't differentiate between the two. So it's not helpful if we try to dismiss perceived stress. Real or perceived, it has an impact on our emotional, mental, and physical well-being. So why is there stress? Because stress, and you'll see that I put the fence as the visual there, it's a response that is intended to protect us from harm. So it's the mind, the body's, the spirit's way of saying, hey, pay attention. And it's set like the fence to create some guardrails. So instead of looking at stress as necessarily being an all-out negative thing, instead, perhaps think about stress as information. It's telling you that something is going on. So our response to it is what is going to help guide us. So our response to stress can be positive or negative. So for instance, in the one example, we talked about the husband's heart attack. If it prompts you to exercise more, changing the diet, it can be a positive. It can be a short-term thing. However, if stress becomes a long-term part of our life, then it can disrupt our life. So for instance, in the example of the sister not returning phone calls, if it reinforces your belief that you'll always be the outsider of the family, that you'll always be shunned, that's a long-term and internalized impact of stress. So the first thing we need to do is say, what is the stress? What information is it presenting to me? And what can I do with that information? Okay. So it only takes just looking around the world to see that people respond differently to stress, depending on one, their stress tolerance ability and their temperament. So for some people, if they get stressed out, they may cuss. Other people, they may get withdrawn. Some people might get a headache. Some might not be able to sleep. Some people might lash out. Some might avoid people. And again, the key here is not to shame or judge our response to stress, and instead say, how do I typically respond? And why do I respond that way? And to give some compassion to those around us to say, why might they be responding the way that they do to stress? Because then we can neutralize it. It becomes less subjective, and we can say, this is information. And here's what I will tell people. All of us have the capacity to deal well with circumstances that come our way. That second sentence in there, I call it when our back is against the wall. And when we're in stress, our back tends to be against the wall. And that's when our personality tends to really rise. So if you're a person who tends to be an introvert, when you're stressed out, you're probably going to shut down even more. If you are a passionate person, kind of a bigger than life person, when you're in stress, you are going to probably be even more so that way. So by understanding that none of us are just those parts, it's our sum whole, and that our response to stress doesn't define who we are. It's one facet. And ask yourself, when my back is against the wall, how do I normally respond? How do those in my life tend to normally respond? How does that farmer down the street? How does that spouse? How do our children? Because then we become less reactionary when we see that it's their back is against the wall and they're probably doing the best that they can. Okay. So let's do some self-reflection. Think about a time in your life when you were presented with extreme stress or a crisis. How did you tend to respond? Were you more passive or active in your behaviors? Were you more introverted or extroverted with your communication? Are you cooperative or competitive? Are you analytical or impulsive? Do you avoid or do you engage with the problem? Because the best way that we can communicate about our stress is to know what our personality style is like. If I am a person who tends to be impulsive with my decision making, probably I'm going to be impulsive when I'm in stress with my communication. If I'm an extrovert, which I am, then my communication is probably going to be that way. So by doing these reflections, we are better equipped to know how we can best communicate when we're dealing not just with the stress within ourselves, but with the stress of others. And we know that in the world of agriculture, in the world of families, in today's world, there are lots of stressors that are out there. So we can't control how other people respond to their stress, but when we become more equipped with knowing our own approach, then we can set ourselves up to be as diplomatic, as neutral, and as objective as possible. So when we're in stress, more likely than not, there are positive and less desirable attributes. So when you're dealing with somebody, if somebody feels withdrawn and that's frustrating to you, remember that we can't all be talkers in the world. It's okay for there to be silence. If you're somebody that needs a lot of space, also realize we need the action-oriented people to get things done. Where we place our focus shapes our energies, beliefs, and our behaviors. So if we decide that we are only going to look at the attributes of stress negatively, that's what we're going to communicate about. That's what we're going to focus on. That's what we're going to believe. If we can believe and communicate that stress can have very positive outcomes, then it doesn't become so scary. Same with conflict. Conflict just is. So by virtue of two human beings being together, conflict's probably going to happen, right? And so looking at both the positive and the less desirable attributes will make us be more holistic in our approach. Okay? So let's talk about the fact that in life, especially with stress, there are external and internal variables. And we know this in agriculture, right? There are forces that are inside of our control, and there are forces that are outside of our control. So when you do the assessment, ask yourself, can this be controlled by me or not? So I gave the example of working overtime. Sometimes we get the choice to work overtime. Sometimes we don't. The internal decision, though, is within our control. So the example I gave below is that you're asked to work overtime and you can decide if you will still do it, if it's an optional one. But let's say working overtime isn't an option. You still have choice. You could decide to change jobs. You could talk to your supervisor. You could ask about shift changes. You could ask, there's lots of choice. So that last bullet point is important, that when we get stressed out, we often forget that there are a lot of external influences that aren't in our control. but there's often a lot more choice than we acknowledge. And when we can take that mindset, it helps how we communicate, it helps how we respond when we're in the throes of stress. So the whole thing is balancing the external and the internal. So if you're dealing with a farm family and they have bad weather that comes their way, which we know can happen, that is an external threat, and that is stressful, right? But what can they control? Could they control, when they buy certain things, when they sell certain things, savings accounts that they have, faith constructs, friends they have in their life, their mental well-being with, counseling or therapy that, can't control if it rains or if it doesn't rain, but there are certain things that I can, and it's balancing those. Okay. So one of the things that I say is that people often get stress confusion. And by that, I mean, they're not even actually sure what the source of the stress is. Have you ever been around somebody where all of a sudden they get to that tipping point and they blow up over something that seems pretty small or minute? Probably they're under stress confusion. They might not even know what actually stressed them out. Or they might not understand why certain people or activities are triggering to them. It's like somebody that's been bitten by a dog and then they don't even know why they get fearful later of the dog. It's because there's triggers, right? Number 3, that we often overestimate the strength of our boundaries. So we think we're going to say no to that, slice of cheesecake that's there, right? Same in stress. We overestimate how strong our discipline is, and we underestimate the amount of choice that we actually have. Okay. So if I know that the strength of my boundary with the cheesecake is not strong, my choice might be that I don't go to the Cheesecake Factory, or my choice might be that I don't keep cheesecake in my house. My choice might be that I slice myself a small piece before I get too hungry. Okay. So instead of shaming ourselves for not having the discipline when we're in stress, say, okay, how can I really put some choices out in front of me? Okay. Evaluating these areas will then help you later de-escalate the stress. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So stress confusion, I'm going to have you take a moment and look at this. That first line. What do you read? Some people read, I am nowhere. Some people read, I am now here. Our lens and our perspective matters. Okay. The last sentence there says, we are not eating broccoli today. Notice that there's no punctuation there. Would it matter if I put a question mark? We are not eating broccoli today. Would it matter if I put an exclamation point? We are not eating broccoli today. Would it matter if I told you, true story, that I have a brother who's a diehard carnivore, and I have a brother who's an adamant vegan? Context matters. So if I send a text message out among the 3 siblings that says, we are not eating broccoli today, I would venture that my brothers would interpret that differently. I'll also say that if I put that in front of my 3 kids, they would say, we're not eating broccoli today. Sometimes our confusion over stress really has to do with little nuances or context or our lived experiences. Okay. So before you decide if you're going to communicate about the stress that you're in, take a step back and say, what is their context? What is mine? Are the details there? Am I reading this with a positive lens? I am nowhere. I am now here. Okay. Perception is reality. And we can also do things to clarify that perception along the way. Okay. So before you decide to communicate about your own stress or to help people deal with their stress, ask yourself some of these self-reflective questions. Think about the stress in your life that you can control. Because the problem is, if you have, let's say, 10 areas that are really stressful, it gets really hard, right? If you can mitigate 5 of those things, then that 5 becomes more tolerable. Okay? Think about the stress you can't control. Right now, I have 3 children. A lot of the stress that's in my life, I can't control because, they're in the hormonal teenage years. They can't drive yet. And so I get to decide how I'm going to acknowledge that stress. Think about the personality traits that you lean towards during stress. And then not just that, your own personality, but also think about the traits that are around you. So if you're dealing with family dynamics, try to assess the personalities that are there. If you're dealing with, the ag world, what are some traits that they bring to the table? And then decide what are the best way to honor your needs and then also the needs of others. Once you've done some of that stress reflection, then we can become better equipped with how we communicate about it. Because then our task then is, if we know that we're in stress, how do we problem solve it? So can we compare our reality with the perception of reality? Do we have a shared understanding of the information? So that previous example of we're not eating broccoli today, do we have a shared understanding of what that means? Is there a question mark? Is there a metaphoric period or an explanation point? And are we even talking the same terms? Is there information that we can get out there? Do we all understand the same time frames? Are we looking at the same outcomes? I've often said it's really interesting when you're dealing with, especially like farm families. You can have, 5 children, and it's like, did they come from the same family? Right? But their needs, requests, demands, their understanding, their reality can all be different. So instead of assuming that we know that, let's problem solve our way through it. Because oftentimes what can seem huge and insurmountable will feel really different once we get the terminology out there, once we get time frames decided on. I'm currently writing a book, and my publisher will keep saying to me, hey, can you get this to me as soon as possible? And finally I said, I'm not sure what your as soon as possible means. Is that tomorrow? Is that 1 week? Is that 10 weeks? Because it creates stress for me not knowing if it's time bound or not. So sometimes even just putting timeframes on is enough to mitigate stress that's there. Okay, so be specific about what it means. And then when you're communicating, problem solve with the standards and the language that's needed. So if you're dealing with legal parameters, figure out, what does that mean? If there are community expectation, organizational practices, okay? If I start speaking legalese with a group of people who don't understand that language, not helpful, right? And I would even tell you that if you're dealing, let's say, with a farm family, don't assume that everybody understands the farm language, because you could have younger children who are learning. You could have in-laws or outlaws, if you will, okay? And nobody wants to be sitting at the table having to say, hey, I don't understand. So break it down for people or ask them, do you understand these principles? If you're talking about probate, wills, estates, that may be regular language for you, and it might be the first time somebody has heard it. That can create its own stress. Just somebody not understanding the language that's out there, okay? Even if you're just saying like, hey, I'm with, FarmLink. What does that mean to somebody who's new to that world? Right? So when we help people actually problem solve, we can explore solutions that we might have ignored, really communicate in language that's universal, identify any underlying issues, and then recognize what can and cannot be controlled. Oftentimes, when people are in stress, I call it ghost scripts. They're the things that are underneath the surface that somebody hasn't even acknowledged. They might not even acknowledge it or know it. When you hear somebody saying, you always, you never, those are indicators to you that there's some other underlying issue there that's probably part of why they're feeling stressed out, that they might not even be able to name, because they might not even consciously know that it's something that's there. Okay. So for some levity here, what's wrong, Penny? Daddy told me Scooby-Doo died. Ralph, why would you tell Penny that Scooby-Doo died? I told her I once scuba dived. Did somebody say Scooby-Doo died? Guess what? Stress can happen simply because we don't hear people properly, or we don't articulate what we think we're going to say. So people will, often say, well, facts can't be disputed. Yeah, and I would say that, guess what? Oftentimes, the devil is in the details, right? Okay. So what is the path? If you're in stress, in a stressful situation, or if you're helping people who are in stress, break it down. If they feel like they're paralyzed, get down to 3 things. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how are we going to get there? Sometimes just keeping it really simple is enough to say, hey, let's focus on the things that really matter, so we don't get bogged down by the things that we necessarily can't control. Okay. And then create a plan. If you're in a professional capacity where you know that you are going to be helping people with stressors, or your work itself is stressful, ask yourself, what are the scenarios that I typically encounter? And then how can I prepare for those? And how might I respond to certain actions? Because it's much easier to have a plan in place than to have to deal with stress as it pops up. So we gave an example of the cheesecake. What can you be prepared for? Maybe don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry, right? That's a metaphor for stress. So if you know that farm families come to you, typically like if there is a health issue, or if there's an aging family member, or if there's on-farm marriages happening where there's off-farm people coming in, those are stressors, right? Somebody divorces, has babies, adopts, goes to college. Certain stressors in life we know are going to have happen, even if they're happy stresses. Having a baby is typically a happy occasion. Buying a house, getting married, but it doesn't mean that they're not stressful. So as a professional, what are the things that you can be prepared for? Okay, and then how might you respond? Part of what we can do to help people in stress, and even for ourselves, is establishing the boundaries, because when we thought through our boundaries, then we know what we can communicate. It's hard to communicate what we haven't put the fence around, right? So the first is identify what is stressful and what our boundaries are, and then be polite but firm. And especially for female practitioners, sometimes we believe that firmness is rude, but it's not. That actually boundaries can be a very loving thing that we can do to help during stress. And then practice small. So even within yourself, if you can start with some small boundary setting, and then you can help other people practice. So you might not be able to have that big, awful, hard conversation right out the gate, but if you practice with something small, then you can get in the habit of practicing what feels safe to you. One of the biggest things that we can do communicating during stress and helping people is to pause, so that our yes means yes and that our no means no. Especially if you're a service provider, it's really ingrained in us that we always have to say yes. That it's like, say yes, say yes, say yes. But if our bucket is so low, we can't give what we don't have in us. So if you want to be a patient person, you can't give patience if you've depleted it. If you want to be a good decision maker, you can't give that gift. So it's okay at times to say no with the idea that you're saving the best yes. And when I say that, I mean, it is okay to be unapologetic, to say no, so that way you can give the best part of yourself to the areas that you want to say yes. So give yourself permission to have guardrails. And then also, it is okay when you're working with people to let them have permission to have guardrails. It is okay to say no. It is okay to need professional and personal self-care and to communicate that. Okay. So we've talked about what stress is and how we can prepare to try to mitigate stress. But we also know, and you can see the volcano here, that sometimes even with the best planning, reflection, and problem solving, stress and crisis are going to happen, right? So if you get in the throes of stress, life throws you that curveball, what can you do to communicate neutrally? And then how can you de-escalate? First thing is to realize, what are the communication blockers that I'm doing? Because one of the worst ways to deal neutrally is to do some of these things on this list. And I'm going to give everybody a chance to look at that. If we say things like, if we criticize, or you ought to, don't worry about, why did you do that? The fact is, this is the way it's always been. So the first part of dealing with communication and stress is to ask yourself, what are the communication blockers that I tend to do? Or what are the communication blockers that I'm observing in the parties that I'm trying to help? The fastest way to shut people down is if you use these communication blockers. And I would challenge you to really think about what do you get triggered by when you hear the blockers? That way you can pay attention to them. And what can you do to ensure that you're addressing the communication blockers if you see them happening around you? Instead, think about the neutral communication. Use neutral affirmation. This isn't saying that you're telling somebody that they're right or wrong if they're stressed out. Instead, it's saying things like, thank you for letting me know you want to talk. It sounds like this is important to you. You're not saying that they're right or wrong or that you're right or wrong. Instead, it's just affirming where they're at. Use open-ended expressions when possible. Reframe the emotion. So instead of saying like, wow, you sound like a raging lunatic when you say that. That's a real way to calm somebody down, right? Or worse yet, tell somebody, calm down. How many times have you heard somebody say, calm down, and that elicits a calming reaction, right? So reframe the emotion. And that goes back to the neutral affirmation. Sounds like this is important to you. Thank you for letting me know you want to talk. Let's describe ways for improvement. Beware of your neutral body language. If I'm crossing my arms, if I'm rolling my eyes, if I lean in, if I lean out, if I engage with my eyes, and then actively listening. Try hard not to immediately move ahead. And we can actively listen by trying to clarify and summarize and restating what we've heard. And then also know that it's okay to have silence. You're communicating a lot of silence. There's no need to shout. Silence can be a good and a bad thing. And I say silence can be really deafening too. I'm going to put my watch up. That was 7 seconds. Feels like an eternity though, right? but silence can be okay. And it can be one of the best forms of de-escalation, of helping people save face, of giving time to process. Okay, so let's move to de-escalation. If you're in the high of stress personally or with other people, when possible, try to move to a private area. Most people, if they're stressed out, don't want it to be on a display. Consider scheduling a specific time to talk, especially if the stress is really escalating, because then it lets people know, hey, I appreciate that this is important, and let's also try to collaborate in a time that allows us to be mindful. Give people personal space, so like, personal bubbles. Allow people to have silence for reflection. When possible in our communication, let's try hard to be non-judgmental, be empathetic, focus on what's behind the feelings. Normally, if somebody has a reaction that seems bigger than what the circumstance is showing, there's usually something in the background that's going on. And allow people the compassion, the space, the understanding to work through that. Okay. And then set and communicate expectations, offer choices, play out consequences, and allow time for decisions. So, I talked about that I'm a mother of children. It's one thing if I say to my kids, hey, I expect for you to be home on time. Well, what does that mean? Home on time could be 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Okay. So set and communicate the expectation, and then also play out the consequences. If you are not home by your curfew at 10 o'clock, you will lose your cell phone tomorrow. Then they get to decide how they are going to deal with those parameters. One of the worst things that we can do, though, is to give nebulous expectations and not let people know what the consequences are. So if you're dealing with a farm family and they say, we're not going to do a will or estate, okay, so what's the consequence of that? Play that out for me, reality test it. You can choose not to do that. And then what's the natural outpouring that will happen? Okay. Let's pull it all together. When we communicate, especially if we're communicating during stress, it's really important to practice the 3 C's. Be clear, concise, and consistent. There's a reason that if you call 911, they use very short sentences, because they know that if people are under stress, the capacity to deal with a lot of information at once can be pretty challenging. So be clear, concise, and consistent. And then the checks and balances during stress is try to plan for emergencies. What are the resources that are there? Who are the people that are available? Piece it all together. Because when you do that, then you're more apt to be able to communicate in a way that lets you put your head on the pillow at night and feel good about that. And I'm not saying what that looks like for you. For some people, there may be times where you have to be more aggressive or you have to be an advocate. There may be times where you need to be calmer and you need to be a peacemaker or you need to be silent. Okay? It's what does that look like for you personally, for the circumstance that you're in, and what is going to be in keeping with your own values so that you feel good about the way that you have dealt with the stress or you've helped other people deal with their stress. Okay? And at the end, remember that a lot of life, we get to choose our lane. Okay? How much can we control? That old adage, not my circus, not my monkeys, means certain things in life, we are best if we put our own oxygen mask on first, that airplane model, and then be disciplined in how you make choices, giving options, and embracing it. And when we do that, when we can be mindful, when we can be grounded, then we can communicate those boundaries that we have, expectations that we have, dealing with the emotions that are there, realizing that stress can be actually a very positive thing if it's done properly. and it can make really empowering change. Helps change the mindset in the way that we deal with and respond to stress. So I'm going to end with the last slide, which is the contact information, the website, the phone number. If anybody has any personal questions, want to get further resources, want to engage in other trainings, feel free to reach out. And ultimately, what I would say is that all of us can be great practitioners of stress management, conflict management, just by being authentic to whatever style is there. So thank you for your time today, and I appreciate your involvement in this session.